Which only you noticed. Am I introducing you?
Yeah, you can.
Great.
Introduce yourself.
I'm a gallerist. I sell vanities to the vainglorious rich. I also happen to work with photography, with ideas, with politics, with many things. But I've known Giles for many, many years, and I also grew up in Africa. And one of the premises about 1 second of light was not to work, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was not necessarily for the book to be about another book in the industry. And so we thought it would be a good idea to interview each other as a two-way Q&A in the book. So that's how I'm sitting here. And I don't know John well enough to even introduce you, except that John works for Medecins Sans Frontières.
No, and I haven't actually met Giles or Roger or any of you. So I'm kind of here as, I guess, because it's NGO related, or it's the kind of world of photography that I come from, which is more kind of photojournalism, storytelling. I'm here, I guess, as a counterpoint to usually find fault with something and ask difficult questions. So that's why I'm here. At the moment, I'm working with MSF, Medecins Sans Frontières, for which Giles has worked in the past. So there is a connection.
Yeah. And yeah, just to explain really, I recently put a collection of photographs together. I didn't want to call it a retrospective because that kind of sounds like I'm close to retirement. But really, I was trying to find stories that I've done over the last 10 years that haven't necessarily been published, haven't necessarily got exposure. And as I was putting these photographs together, I had a kind of revelation, really, I suppose, where I was looking at the shutter speeds of all these pictures, and there was about 100 and something photographs. And I worked out the shutter speeds of all those pictures put together really only equates to 1 second of time. And I was interested in this idea that we see photographs as these permanent records, and really they are just fleeting moments in the lives of others. And they can give us a little window, a little insight into those people's lives. But really, we have to accept that that is just a fraction of a second. So the idea, as I say, for tonight's talk was to go through some of those photographs and explain a little bit maybe some of the stories behind them, why they were taken. To give a very brief as well introduction to my work, 10 years ago I gave up editorial photography and any commissions to do self-funded work because I felt I was too restricted by newspapers, magazines, and editorial constraints, and I wanted to tell the stories that I found rather than the stories I was told were there. So all the work you'll see tonight was all self-funded initially, and was really set out to try and tell stories that weren't necessarily being covered by the media. I always say that if I go somewhere and there's another photographer working there, I'm probably in the wrong place because it's already being done. It's also really good if you're the only photographer, you tend to be the best one there. So I thought we'd just go through some of the photographs tonight. We can just discuss. I say I've known Roger for a long time. He gives me a really, really hard time. We did this interview that's in the book. I was actually in Cambodia at the time and he was in London. I'd drunk quite a lot of beer, he hadn't. So I didn't remember a lot of the conversation when we went through it, so it'll be fresh for me tonight as well, actually. But yeah, so 1 second of light. I was going to start with actually this set of pictures, which was done in Angola. And this photograph actually really is an interesting one for me because it sums up a lot about actually how I see my own work has changed a lot. This was one of the first stories I ever did when I started doing my own documentary. And it was a place, a fascinating story actually. The Civil War just ended. Well, it ended a few years ago, but in this area the fighting had continued. And there was this school, this old school church, Catholic school, that had been kind of used by widows of the war. They were hiding because the government forces come there. They were related to rebel soldiers. They were very fearful of retribution. And actually it was the Catholic priest who told me about this place. And he's like, it's incredible because the lighting is just amazing. And I was kind of trying to be very sincere. And I'm like, I'm not interested in the lighting. I'm here for the stories and all the rest of it. And of course I got there and the lighting was amazing. And I saw what he was talking about. And as I say, it's interesting for me because now looking back on it, when I actually turned up, I was struggling because the women all ran away when they saw me, which is actually the story of my life. But in particular on this case, they were very fearful. They didn't know who I was. They thought I might be connected with the government. So I would turn up every day and I would just sit there quietly until bit by bit they would start returning and carrying on with their day-to-day life. And it took about a week. And it's when I learned the skill that really, as a photographer, you have to try and be the most boring person in a room, and then people soon start to forget you. But what happened by the point that I was taking these photographs is that the women had got more than just used to me, and they kind of had a game, which was whenever I was trying to take a photograph, one of them would try and pinch my ass. And now looking back on it, it's kind of, at the time, I remember thinking these pictures had to be very reverential and very serious. And now
That's my problem with these pictures. As much as I love them and as much as I came to the project, I'm not saying that there's not a picture of you getting your ass pinched, but sort of there isn't a picture of you getting your ass pinched, because in a way the first picture, the first incredible picture, which is on all the publicity for this event, it looks incredibly well composed. I'm sort of calling you Salgado here, not in a good way. It's got a kind of like Goya-esque, Velasquez-esque kind of beautiful composition, and I sort of have a problem knowing the story about, like, I feel like there were photographs you didn't take that weren't incredibly well composed. You know, if a lot of your kind of creed is about taking not the one shot of a person, and what you said already about kind of not the book's title about not having that split, that not proclaiming that somehow that fraction of a second declares the entire character of some of these women. Where are the pictures of them being more playful and less, you know,
no, exactly.
war widow in
No, and so
Angola?
these photographs, in many ways, I think I put my own identity very strongly on them, because I wanted to create these images that I thought were very serious. And so, as I say, I look back on this story, although, you know, it's still, for me, beautiful photographs, but I definitely look back and I think I missed the opportunity to take the real story, which was these women laughing, was the humour.
Do you think, being one of the first kind of new ways of working in this way, that you almost had to unlearn a lot of what you knew or relied on before to cut through it?
No, and I think that's the thing. It's actually really enjoyable for me to put this collection together, because I do look at pictures and think, God, I would have done that so differently now. And as I say, I think I went there because I wanted to be Salgado, or I wanted to be creating, and I came out of editorial photography, and I knew stuff had to look beautiful to be used by magazines. And I was missing the point, which was what these people's stories were. You have to spend time, and it's not what you go there with, it's not what you go with in your head, and it's often the unexpected. And you know, now I come back with photographs. You know, I did a story on Syrian refugees in Lebanon last year, and it was a young girl with spina bifida, but she's actually playing hopscotch with her friends, and it's a laughing picture. And
I mean, they may be rawer and kind of you know, rough around the edges, but it's being self-funded, or you know, you're the judge of whether they work or not.
Yeah.
As opposed to just purely the aesthetic of it.
And I think it's a whole issue with photography for NGOs, is this idea of, do you photograph people as victims? Do you photograph people as looking desperate? You know, for a long time, and still a lot of NGOs do that. But for me personally, that's often not the story. That's not the people that you find.
Well, you're photographing for a commission, however noble or worthwhile the commission is. Even if you're photographing for John, like, are you photographing what you see, and are you a conduit for the story, or are you imposing the story that whoever's commissioned the pieces, which is
yeah. I mean, and this actually was a continuation which was done at the same time, which was connected. There was a Catholic, small Catholic mission, and these nuns were running this incredible place. They were cut off really from the world, so they were all self-funded, and they picked up these various orphans from all sorts of different stories. Most of them had lost family members, and they sort of ended up as a family, really. And I remember doing the pictures there, and although some of them were kind of in a more traditional way, a lot of what I found there was moments like this one, which actually is kind of the beginning of what I wanted to do with photography, which is often the banality of life. You know, Cartier-Bresson was the kind of decisive moment. I'm kind of the indecisive moment in between. And it's often those moments of tenderness. And so here, you know, it's a nun brushing somebody's hair, and the girl's actually laughing and smiling, and actually the nun was really scary and really brushing it hard. But it was a beautiful scene of tenderness, and kind of, for me, these are the moments that I then continue to try and explore.
I mean, when you work in that kind of way, I mean, if you're working on a tight assignment, you've got a short period of time, you've got an editor back home who's going to, you know, judge it based on what they want to use it for. And what kind of period of time would you be able to allow yourself working for?
Well, I mean, now, I mean, you know, months really. Right. I mean, this one I went and lived in Angola for 6 months when I started, But I actually remember coming back with this picture and this story and being told, but this picture didn't show suffering, so where was the story?
Right,
You know?
right.
Because they wanted to see pictures of people that were starving and desperate.
So this was still for an NGO at the same time?
No, this was purely, I actually went and found this story
Right.
on my own and then came back and nobody wanted to publish it. And I remember thinking, well, maybe I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Are you going to show later, I think you are because they're in the book, but the pictures of the Ukrainian kids?
Yeah, that
So
will.
for me, sorry to jump ahead,
No,
but this image we've just been looking at now of a woman doing somebody's hair is allowing the ordinary to happen. In other words, again, not like I'm going to paraphrase you here, but let me have a go. You once said that many photographers are interested in the things that make us different, but that you've always been more interested in common moments that could be taken anywhere. That a refugee is not a refugee. A refugee is a mechanic, a teacher, a doctor, a taxi driver. And so, with this picture, I think of, and I also think there's a great image of a Ukrainian kind of street kid who's a junkie, and a commissioned photograph would make sure that you could see a needle in his vein, but he's sweeping a bedroom. Well, they're sweeping their room, and there's a kind of divorce from the commissioned photograph and allowing people to be, which is, for me, kind of the most interesting, the implicit rather than the explicit in your work.
No, and I think, funny enough, I had the similar. I'm covering the refugee crisis in Lesbos at the moment, and I was just writing a story, and I had a bit of a debate with somebody about whether it was serious enough. And for me, it was a story that kind of humanized what's going on there. And we've been watching boats kind of crashing and children dying every day. It's been really brutal and very hard to tell those stories. But there was one boat, and quite a big incident had happened, and basically a smuggler had come on the boat. And normally the smugglers don't cross with the refugees, they let the refugees cross themselves. But this family had begged, saying, please, could the smugglers come? So the smugglers had come to help these refugees cross, and then got caught by the Coast Guard, and there'd been a big incident with the Coast Guard coming. And so we're interviewing, and it was a very, somber story. And then there's this one young Syrian guy there, and he was looking really confused, and he goes, what happened? What smugglers? And everyone's going, well, the smugglers that came and then he was like, I didn't see that. And everyone's looking at him going, what boat were you on? He was like, no, I was on the boat, but I was at the front. And everyone's going, but it's a small boat, how did you miss that? And everyone's going, this guy is so stupid, he misses everything that goes on. Now, that kind of story for me, it's kind of trivial and silly, but it humanizes the people that were on that boat. And suddenly they don't become refugees, they become normal people. And so then the tragedy of what's happening to them, you can relate to much more.
You can, but I'm just going to be like the devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
From your point of view, you're a photographer. You can't become a refugee. In this situation, you can live with the banality of life and find these kind of small moments that transcend the crisis or the drama. But sometimes that can be destabilizing for a photographer. You can turn around and start asking questions of, what is it that I'm here for? Some of the best projects I know are by photographers, for example, who have, let's say, done a story on gangland in London of old gangsters. And one of the ways they get accepted into these kind of projects and get shown a lot of things is because they get respected, because the people they're photographing know that they don't want to be like them. And there's a healthy separation. So how do you maintain that kind of familiarity and also your healthy separation in that you are bringing the photo somewhere else? There is a distinct audience. You do want to motivate people, but you want to do it in a different way. How do you reconcile your role in that?
It's really difficult, and I don't believe in this idea of the truth of photography, and people when they refer to being like fly on the wall and telling the truth. Any photographer in a refugee camp is like the elephant in the room. It's pretty obvious there's somebody walking around with a camera and taking photographs. And so I suppose for me, part of it as well is accepting that is my role, and I'm not there to tell the truth. I go there with my own opinion. I go there with a prejudice, and I'm trying to tell a narrative. So I'm trying not to do that, but I'm aware that I am doing that, if that makes sense.
And and I guess doing yourself justice, and in the process doing them justice.
Yeah, and I often think, because there's a big argument for, the Syrian refugee crisis is a great example of a society that has great photographers, that has artists, that has journalists, why they're not covering it themselves. I met an Afghan journalist on a boat recently. It was a really strange experience because this boat was coming in, and I was trying to take a photograph, again trying to do the reverential photograph, and there's a guy waving at the front. And I'm kind of going, stop waving, it's ruining the picture. And he gets off the boat and walks up to me and he goes, you're the legless photographer, in perfect English. And I'm like, this is not the narrative that's supposed to happen to the refugee coming off the boat. And he gives me a big hug, and he was a journalist from Kabul.
Right.
But again, I was saying to why
things get kind of too close for comfort.
Yeah, but
there isn't a separation.
But so obviously there's an argument that these people should be telling the story because they can tell it in a different way.
Should have been doing a story in here.
Yeah. It'd be like, and I got off the boat and there was a legless guy taking pictures of me. But again, I think the thing is not to pretend that I can tell it in the same way that he could tell it,
right.
and to tell it as I'm trying to almost be a translator. I'm going there and I'm experiencing something that's pretty hard to comprehend in whatever place it is, and I'm trying to find a way to translate that slightly so that my friends, my family can understand that story a bit,
right.
and not saying, yes, I'm the person who's telling the truth, that's telling everything. It's not.
But also to challenge us.
Yeah.
So you're not giving it to us on a plate with every cliche that we expect or want to see, and taking it a bit further and making us work a bit harder.
No, exactly. And if you can tell a story about, a refugee crisis and make people laugh, you're not supposed to do that. People go, no, but we're supposed to be. But then I think that is, it's like Shakespeare. It's pathos.
It's disarming. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, this was an interesting project in terms of being a photographer and again, talking about these things, was photographing people who have been victims of acid attacks in Bangladesh, and how you approach somebody that was trying to rebuild their confidence and rebuild their life with them knowing that you were taking their photograph because of their injuries. It was a really strange thing because these people, as I say, were trying to, this is a person called Dolly who had a terrible story about being attacked, ended up married to the perpetrator, this whole experience. And when I went there to photograph her, she was very shy about this idea, and she was, again, obviously very smart. She's like, you're photographing me because I look terrible. But I got to know her and actually went back to see her again just 6 months ago, years later. But in the end, she was doing her makeup and everything for these photographs. But again, this was a whole question of like, why are you taking a photograph? What was the point of doing it?
So in some ways, it's a reconciling process for herself.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, it was something that we tried to actually make the people involved in the process of why, of taking a photograph.
And they saw their pictures as you went along, or
yeah.
Have they got your pictures?
No, I mean, I went back and when I saw Dolly, I wanted to give her the picture, but she wasn't interested in that. But again, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I was photographed myself moments after I got injured. So I'm probably one of the few photographers that kind of has the experience of being both sides of it all. And it's a very weird thing because you are photographing people because something terrible has happened to them. And often these people want to get over it, and the last thing they want is somebody to coming basically saying, I want to photograph you because your face is disfigured.
And is it a helpful process?
I think for some people it can be. I mean, if people feel there is a purpose to it, one of the things I've noticed in a lot of refugee camps in Lebanon, for example, there's a couple of refugee camps that people always go to take photographs. And the people there go, why? Because you've taken thousands of photographs of us. People have come and taken thousands of photographs. Our life hasn't changed.
And they're like losing faith in the process of photography.
So I think people often at the beginning can kind of think, well, this is great. I want to get my story across. But then if somebody is photographed again and again and again, and you do see it with some NGOs that they take the photographers to certain people they know and cooperate, and then you see that picture's 10 times that one person.
Yeah.
Sticking with Lebanon, I'm setting you up to tell an anecdote spontaneously here.
Okay. Nobody will know.
Because I don't think the picture's in the book, so it's never going to work like this. We were talking the other day about you saying that there was just exactly what John's just been saying, that if you're photographing somebody because something's happened to them, that's not helpful. But is it ever helpful that something's happened to you? Like, is there a degree of empathy? Maybe you're talking about the lady in Lebanon where you went upstairs. But surely, as much as you keep saying and should keep saying that your work is a continuum before and after your injuries, and you can see that throughout the book, you didn't just wake up one day and discover empathy, or nearly die one day and discover empathy. There seem to be incidents where the fact that something's happened to you puts you in a different role to the kind of photographer victim, photographer subject, where the empathy is kind of flowing both ways, which strikes me as also unusual, but actually quite pragmatically useful for you, no?
Yeah, I mean, there's a picture. I mean, this is no particular order. So there's a picture that will come up later of a young boy that's been shot in actually in an MSF hospital in South Sudan. And this 12-year-old boy had been shot, and I had to make a decision about whether I wanted to photograph him. And I took a couple of frames, and then it kind of felt like a complete vulture. Like I photographed this boy that's potentially dying, and you can think, well, I'm here for the right reasons because I'm telling a story. But at the end of the day, it's a 12-year-old boy who's dying, and you've just taken a photograph of him. I suppose having gone through what I've gone through, there is a slight difference now that sometimes people who are injured, they will see my injuries, they will think, okay, this guy knows something about what I've gone through. And yeah, I mean, I think it's about trust. You know, good photography is a conversation, it's about trust. And it maybe speeds that process up because the motivation of why you're being there, they kind of know you're not just there because it's a bit of a laugh.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's also about not breaking down that relationship. I mean, I deal with it a lot in terms of consent. You know, and I guess I've come across it more in working in NGOs than I have in magazines and newspapers, which is in magazines, newspapers, media. If it's happening, it's out there, we want to see it, we want to record it. You know, it would almost be a dereliction of duty not to. On the other side, in NGOs, you want to record it because it's actually what all the work you're doing is about, or the delivery of medical, you know, aid and responses to it. But you have this secondary step back from the subject or from the moment, asking for extra consent. And when it can be incredibly difficult, it's obviously not appropriate when someone's, you know, shot and lying on a bed and being treated to interrupt everyone and ask consent and, you know, actually sign a form for consent because they really want to be, you know, consistent and thorough. So I think there's a real moment there where you have to, a photographer has to be instinctive and also very, you know, sympathetic or sensitive. And, you know, shoot first in some ways, like the old adage, and ask questions later. But, you know, make sure you ask those questions. And if you didn't, you might almost be just standing there silently as an observer. And then you'd be wondering, well, what am I here for? And then you're an extra person in the room that's not needed. So I think there's a very fine line between...
Surely if you don't shoot first sometimes, you end up with a scenario where the pictures aren't really that great. For your objective, which is to fundraise for 1.5 billion or whatever your turnover is, like how do you...
Yeah, the added contradiction of actually that is in some ways, you know, for every embarrassment of, you know, that moment, the picture you need that works the most. And often, you know, it's an intuitive, humanistic kind of moment that you respond to. It's not just, hopefully, depending on, you know, the integrity of the person behind the camera, it's not just a money picture that you know other people will want to see. It's something that you respond to, that you know, this is why I've come all this way. You know, not as a prize for coming all that way, but actually because, you know, it gives it the importance of, you know, or the privilege in some ways of being there at that moment. And to step back from it would almost then put you in a kind of separate zone of, you know, waiting for permission. And I imagine, you know, yes, with injuries, you could have a certain shared experience, but it's also people will respond, you know, with the confidence of you're here because this is what's happening and you know why you're here. And that often can carry you a long way.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I don't really photograph stuff that's action. I mean, recently in Lesbos with the boats, it's slightly different. But actually, I had an experience in Lesbos last week where there was something going on with a Syrian family, and I thought it was a powerful photograph, but I wasn't comfortable that they were comfortable about it. So I needed to get my translator, who was down the road. So somebody was getting hurt, and two other photographers turned up and they started taking pictures. And then by the time my translator got there, even the people I was photographing, they actually jokingly said to her, "Oh, he's missed his moment now."
Yeah.
And I was like, "But I would rather work that way."
Right.
And so, you know, I've noticed really recently a lot of times I've missed the opportunity to get a photograph. But what I've done is I've then spent time with the people that I would have been photographing and found out their story. And then I often get a photograph that comes later.
You didn't get the photograph, but you got something that's much...
Yeah.
Like
the lasts longer
the explicit
in
and the
some
implicit picture, the kind of narrative-based photograph. Excuse my language, fuck the narrative-based photograph. You didn't get that photograph, that commissionable photograph.
No.
You got something else through that.
Exactly, so it might just be a picture of their hands or something more subtle that only comes from understanding their story. So the way I personally work, which is not to say there's right or wrong, but is always to step back. And there's so many times when I miss pictures.
Right.
And part of me is like, oh, I should have just taken the photograph. But especially with Syrians who are very nervous often about having their faces in pictures and very uncomfortable about the issues of what happens to their family members if something happens.
Right.
You know, I've seen a lot of photographers taking pictures that I don't feel comfortable they should be taking.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a personal confidence to make that choice and to do it. And maybe a lot of the ones I'm saying shoot first and ask questions later is, you know, that way you bulldoze your way through the situation without having to ask yourself the question. And it's just about having the confidence to, you know, basically justify your being there.
Yeah, and exactly, and that role is important in some photography. You know, some photography has to be done that way, where you can't wait around and ask for approval. And I'm just going to flick through these ones quickly. These are lots of pictures of banality. This is in Zatari refugee camp, and actually this was, I was asked to go and photograph the camp, and I just decided to spend time with one family. But again, it was a lot about the banality that was going on in their day-to-day life, and like laughing with neighbours and day-to-day things like their cat, which is called Rat Catcher, which apparently he's never caught a rat in his life. But they brought with them, and it was just like very normal life in this camp. And the kids, just being everything was just a very normal, very day-to-day life, but in the chaos. And for me, that's the thing I've always been interested in, is the stories of individuals caught up in events far beyond our sort of understanding. So these were in Angola again when I was starting out, and this was a set I did of, these were prisoners of war. They were rebel soldiers, and they were being held in a prison camp, and all of them had been child soldiers themselves. And I remember talking to one of them who explained to me how they used to come to the villages, the rebel UNITA forces in Angola, and they would take the children at night, and they would often force them to kill a family member. And the kids were terrified of the rebels anyway. They knew the rebels lived nearby. When they turn up at night, there's panic, everything going on. And so they give these young kids a gun and say, shoot somebody or we're going to kill everybody. And in a panic, they would kill a family member. Then they'd be taken into the jungle, and then the rebels, great psychology, they would turn around and say, well, you have to stay with us now. You killed somebody in your own village. You can never go back there. They will kill you for what you've done. We are now your family. And so these were sort of 12, 13-year-old kids. And I was really interested because these were those kids when they'd grown up, and nobody had kind of saved them as kids. And they'd gone on to become perpetrators themselves of these crimes. And I was really interested in this idea of at what point, you know, you look at a child soldier and everyone goes, oh, this is terrible, we have to save them. And then people looking at these people going, these are monsters who are doing these crimes. And I was really interested in this idea of at what point do we lose our sympathy? At what point does somebody become culpable for the crimes that they're doing? And again, nobody was interested in photographing these people. They wanted to, you know, actually the paper that I was doing this for had asked me to take some pictures of child soldiers. And I said, I came back with these. And they were like, these aren't child soldiers. And I went, they are. They've just grown up.
Child soldiers grown up.
Yeah. And they didn't publish it.
These are, well, I wanted to ask you specifically about these. Your use of text with pictures, because if you didn't tell us that, or if you hadn't written that next to the captions when you show them in exhibitions or books, this room and all of us would look at these guys very differently. We'd read the look in their eyes. We wouldn't, you know, this incredible thing to be a child soldier and then just do these terrible things, but never have a childhood, never have an adolescence and all these things. But we're reading that to an extent. And for me, I don't think that's at all a failing of the photograph. I think all photographs should have words, narrative. We talked about this earlier. You know, the kind of balance between words and photographs can be portals to other conversations, and you research things and so on. But can you say a little bit about this, particularly with regard to these, but all the pictures in the book and other pictures you've taken, about the symbiosis between word and image? And it sounds like you're not scared of the former.
No, I mean, I've really changed, because again, if I look at those pictures, the first pictures we saw of Angola, you know, I would just kind of go, war weirdos, Angola, because I was taught, almost as a documentary photographer, you know, the photograph speaks for itself.
I hate that.
You know, it's worth 1,000 words.
It's just shorthand for I couldn't be bothered to tell you what the whole story
Exactly.
was. Hopefully it's pretty enough to speak.
Yeah, and now increasingly I'm finding it's going the other way, and I'm writing, and the photograph, and now that's why I do both, because I find that the relationship of the two is really important. So again, you know, talking about Lesvos, I was interviewing a Syrian guy, and he had an incredible, powerful story about what had happened to him, and then the boat he was on sunk, and he had been tortured by ISIS himself, and then he finally got on this boat, it sunk, you know, children died all around him, he's traumatized from that. And the photograph is just of his hands, but it only works because there's 2,000 words that go with it. Right. So it's kind of, I've gone almost to the other extreme now, where the photograph is part of the text. as opposed to...
And when you zero in on like a real personal story like that, yet the issue is so large, how do you allow these people, or the story that you have to read to go with it, to kind of apply to like almost every man in this situation? Because the way of relating directly, hoping to kind of engage someone is, this is a person, this is their story, I've spent the time and I can tell you their story, and they're telling you their story, and on that level, you might relate, and you might forget what this other background is, that's everything going on to everyone else. But in the back of your mind, it's also important that they somehow represent this larger issue that's occurring to lots of people. So how do you relate that single story back out to the...
Well, I think it's almost because I'm trying
issue?
to do the opposite. So, for example, with all the boats of refugees you see arriving and migrants, I've seen articles talking about the volunteers that are helping, the teams that are helping, but I've heard hardly any stories about the people on those boats and why they were on that boat and what it was that they were fleeing from, and what that story is behind. So for me, it's really just taking one or two stories, and I'm not trying to say this, being clever in my writing and applying it in a bigger scope. It's simply saying, here's one story, here's another story. Because again, there is no one story, there is no one experience.
Everyone,
I mean, the boats are arriving. How can you explain the story of an Afghan who's fled the Taliban next to somebody who's come from Damascus, who's next to somebody who's come from Somalia?
In that sense, do you kind of benefit, I suppose, from this other media coverage, which won't drill down into personal stories and present something that's almost unmanageable for the viewer here to take in, because it's just too large and they're all nameless. It's too many people in one go. So that's the background to perhaps our interest of wanting to know more or wanting to relate more, and that gives you the entry almost to...
Yeah, because if you can have that one human story, if you can have that one element that somebody engages with and says... There was a story in Afghanistan, and I don't even have a photograph of it, of the guy, because it wasn't a great opportunity, but his story was so brilliant that he basically was a young kid that got blown up. This is not the brilliant part of the story. He got blown up on his way to school one day by an American grenade and quite badly injured. But what was brilliant was the way he told me the story. And again, it'd be very easy to tell his story of like he was a victim, and we'd all go, but I don't really relate to him. His story was that he hated going to school, and his dad had caught him bunking off school, and his dad said, no, you have to go to school. He's like, I don't like school. But anyway, he'd go on, started bunking off school again. His dad had caught him, and his dad was like, look, I work in the fields. You're not going to end up like me. You have to get an education. And he was like, fine. And again, he started bunking off, and this time when his dad caught him, he said, I will beat you. I will punish you so severely if you do not go to school. You will not end up like me. So this kid's then saying, and so I went to school the next day and I got blown up. He said, as soon as I told my dad, I said, I told you school wasn't good for me. But immediately that becomes something that you can relate to, and you can think, well, that's like my cousin, or that's like my nephew, that's like somebody, that's human, as opposed to showing a picture of a kid in a hospital looking injured, and we go, I don't relate to that at all. So for me, my role is to find those stories, those moments of normality in the bigger crisis. And I'll let the other journalists and other people tell you how many million people there are.
But even with the Lesbos photographs, I mean, I'm sure there are many other incarnations of it, but at least in the Observer story from a week and a half ago, you're actually, again, being this kind of conduit of the story, that great quote from the guy, the father, who's holding the kids. And your instinct tends to be, as a writer and a photographer, is to find the personal stories in the meta-narrative.
I really like people. I mean, I really love people. I love meeting people and their stories, and so it doesn't really make any difference to me whether you're on the beach in Lesbos or I'm sitting in a pub. It's like I'm interested in somebody's story, and all I really want to do is share that and pass that on. And so just because somebody's story is wrapped up in the middle of the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War doesn't mean they're any different. And so it's about engaging with people and trying to pass that on. These are the wonderful Rohingya in... Okay, this is a completely irrelevant story. I didn't notice this. This was in Kutupalong, which is a refugee camp in Bangladesh. And it was a story there about the fact that in this particular camp, 25,000 people living in an unofficial camp. And we'll come to some pictures later that tell the story, but this is just one of these weird coincidences in photography. So over several weeks, I did pictures. And you'll see this photograph, and it was a family. And then days later, I took this photograph, and I had them up in an exhibition. And there's a prize to the first person that connects those two pictures together. Yeah, somebody's wearing the left one and somebody's wearing the right one. And completely by chance, I ended up with the pictures of these two people next to each other who were wearing the same flip-flops, but one got one pair and one's got the other shoe.
What's the prize? Let's try and get that.
Yeah. But again, when I was just putting this together, I realized how many pictures I had. People cutting hair, people brushing hair, people. It's these little moments that I find much more interesting. Like that for me is more powerful about the story about the people in this camp than the pictures of thousands of people.
Well, you don't. I guess you don't cut hair if you have no expectation to be around tomorrow, or or also kind of how you want to appear and looking after oneself. I mean, it's the kind of thing everyone can relate to.
Well, I don't think you see that person as a victim then.
No.
That doesn't look like a victim, even though they're living in these appalling circumstances. It's again giving them a humanity and giving them a dignity.
Yes, it rolls a cigarette.
Hmm?
Yes, it rolls a cigarette.
Yes. I actually really don't like to show pictures of people suffering. Like, I try and avoid it if people, but this actually was kind of, these are one of the few pictures of people that look like they're suffering, and they kind of weren't, because these were kids getting vaccinations that were just screaming desperately because they were getting injected. And yeah, it's like any kid in any school.
It is hard though. I mean, it's one of the things, when I started working at MSF, people were asking me, isn't it time that NGO or, pictures of people in these situations, that the language of photography should change, because, there's so many new ways and so many different outlets for it. But maybe you can help me and answer, the conundrum is those pictures that I guess we would call, the old language of NGOs or over-repeated, they do work on a certain level. So, I can totally understand not wanting to take those pictures because they're almost too easy. They don't tell you really enough about that person. They're just a momentary experience of something horrific that everyone would want to react to in the same way. But they do work. So when you're working perhaps alongside an NGO, or you want these pictures to galvanize and change opinion, it's harder perhaps, with people who won't spend as much time to really read into it and find out the stories with those kind of pictures than it is with something that's very cliche.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that in terms of the goal of what you'd like?
It is really hard. I got when I was keep returning to it, but in Lesbos the other week, and somebody from a major news outlet knew I was there, and I got a text on my phone going, "Do you have pictures of distressed kids? If so, we can run them today." And I was just like, well, I mean, that's not why I'm here to take these pictures. But the point. But then I was also torn, because part of me was I was desperate to get the story out, because people were dying and nobody was doing anything. So part of me was like, well, am I not doing the right thing because this is a major outlet that wanted to run some pictures of distressed kids?
We can also blame major outlets for having those kind of editorial decisions, going, okay, I definitely don't want to feed their editorial decisions and pander to the same kind of rhetorical defunct language of photography, but they also are in some ways passing on. I don't know which way it works, whether they're passing on the desires of their readership or the reactions of their readership, and they know their readerships, and they know that those kind of pictures generate comments, generate people galvanized to try and do something. And maybe that in itself is misguided, but it comes from somewhere.
No,
and when I say they work,
really difficult,
they change people's. People get worked up about them, which is what you, I suppose, want to achieve.
No, and it's very hard. It's like whether I take a photograph of, a family and I spend time with them and they're very balanced pictures, as opposed to a picture of a child that's being resuscitated on the beach that everybody's going to go, oh my God. But for me, I'll let other photographers do that, and I think it's important they do.
Right.
For me, I'm trying to show who was that kid on the beach?
To broaden it.
Yeah, who's that kid? Why should we care about that kid? What was the kid doing before? What are they going to be doing next?
Right.
What's their story? I mean, this is actually going into. Actually, this was one of the closest moments I've ever been to being shot. And this is when I decided digital photography was a really bad idea.
Because they wanted to see.
Yeah, because these kids had all been given these AK-47s. It's one of those weird things in places where there's nothing. They all seem to have new weapons, and they were all really posing for these pictures, and you can see they're kind of like trying to be like a sort of gangster, and they were posing. And every time I took a picture, they all ran to see the picture on the back of my thing. And none of them knew how to use the safety catches or anything like that. So as they're all pushing around, they were literally these gun barrels being pointed, pushed into it. And suddenly his gun went off, and everybody dived on the floor. And I'm just there going, God, like, I don't want to take any more. They would take more pictures, take more pictures. I'm like, no, I don't want to.
It'll be easy. I'll post it to you later.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so yeah, I went back to shooting on film, and now nobody can see it. They still run around, and go, but where's the picture? You know. But yeah, that was one of the most stupid reasons to ever get shot in your life. Was just people trying to see the picture. But then this is then, you know, the kid I was talking about that was shot and making that decision about whether you take a photograph like that. And I still, you know, question this. I chose not to photograph his wounds and not to show the whole thing of what was going on. But in some ways, I don't know if that was worse or better. Whether I should have shown that, because then people would be horrified. For me, I was trying to give him some dignity within a really difficult circumstance. But I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
I don't think there can be a blanket one-size-fits-all response, because otherwise then you would be not really responding to the situation or how you feel, or, you know, the level of closeness that you feel you've come to, or perhaps what else you want to do around this that isn't just that moment on an operating table.
But if you showed the rest of his guts or whatever was happening, then I think I really like post Sontag. We have a real sense of like, we know we've told ourselves whether we have an inbuilt defense towards shock. We've told ourselves we have, so we sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Surely this is more haunting and lasting, also for John's purposes. Not that this was.
It's more usable, perhaps.
Yeah, but also maybe it's more usable because it's more publishable.
It's
but
more
also,
palatable.
Doesn't it last longer because it doesn't have the explicit? So you actually spend more time dwelling with it. And
but then you could argue it won't shock people into action. It won't shock people into.
I mean, I think you have to just have a clear, story and integrity of making that decision, because I'm not a fan at all of a post-Sontag world. You know, tell that to my 13-year-old kid. He doesn't give a damn who Sontag was. Yeah. And and I certainly don't think at 13 he's got a case of compassion fatigue. Yeah. They're definitely exposed to more things, but I think it would be slightly presumptuous of us to say these are the next generation has somehow learned everything by our experiences. They should experience it.
Yeah, all these kids that Giles goes and talks to have hundreds and hundreds of pictures on their iPhones. It doesn't mean that they still want to take good portraits. They still want to work with you in workshops, and they still have the notion of a worthwhile photograph. Yeah. Just because they're saturated in images, theorists have said that that's the end of the image. They still want.
It's a challenge back to us.
That look like something and want to take those pictures.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're just on that generational thing. I would suggest, but I guess everyone in the room has their own experience of it. Is that it's a challenge back to us to I'm talking about pictures that I think work or don't work. That's a narrow definition based on my narrow experience of where I've worked and what I see around me. But it's a challenge back to us to look at the generations coming through, and not just from here, like you said, with the guys with the guns wanting to see the picture. They have a way of judging whether this works for them, and I think that's a challenge for us to kind of speak to a wider audience than just the one we think we already know.
No, because I get told that kids are not interested, that they have fatigue, etc. But almost guaranteed, if I go into a school, especially talking to sort of 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are the ideal of a generation that doesn't have an attention span, is constantly flicking through stuff. But if you show a photograph like this and tell the story of that kid, you see kids in tears and really angry and wanting to do something about it. So I think it's the engagement. I think it's the fact that, yes, they may be seeing thousands of images, but if you put that image in context, if you tell the story of that image, if you make somebody listen to that, then I don't think there's any difference in generations.
We said it before downstairs that sometimes the best way of judging something that you think is right or wrong is 15 pictures in front of my 13-year-old kid and go waiting for them to end up on the one that you think is brilliant. They go straight past it and think the one that you didn't even notice, they think that one's brilliant. And that to me is not a kind of failure of photography. It's just really intriguing. And then I start looking in this one that they really engage with and think that there's something there that I need to learn.
Yeah. So I know Roger's going to give me a hard time about these pictures because they're completely sort of out of context, but there's a reason for them within this book and this collection.
So for somebody who spends his life making, and just been talking for I don't know how long, 40 minutes about how he never uses the explicit. It's always the implicit. The most explicit pictures you can take of explosions, and they're not people in them, so that's sort of interesting. They're slightly abstract photographs, but they're also just bloody great explosions. Tell us about why.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested. I'm not a war photographer. I've got no interest in taking pictures of people firing guns, mainly because I'm too scared to get anywhere near all that side of things. But I've always been interested in the impact of conflicts on people, how it affects them. We live in a world where in the First World War, 95% of casualties were soldiers. We now live with 90% almost in most conflicts are civilians. And yet the narrative still is often of people firing guns, of the action. But at the same time, if you spend that time around conflict, around war, it's also sort of, there's a sort of, I wouldn't say fascination, but trying to understand what it is, what is the core. And really, I suppose for me, there's nothing more visceral than the power of, this is in Afghanistan with American firepower, and you just see the absolute destructive power that is brought. You can see on this first picture, that's a whole, like a big old Mujahideen fort. So if you imagine that's a big old complex, and then you see that's it there. So you get an idea of how big that power is. And so I suppose as a photographer who's an anti-war photographer, somebody said to me, "Are you a war photographer?" I said, "No, I'm an anti-war photographer." But this is the kind of the culmination. This is the point that causes all the misery. This huge amount of power that can be brought to bear, that then creates generations and generations of misery. So I think that was the reason I was drawn to take these photographs.
Is it also kind of somewhat seductive moment where the two things kind of meet almost?
Well, that's what I mean. It's and again, because I think there's a real danger in a lot of war photography of glamorizing war. I grew up, loving pictures of the Vietnam War. It all seemed very cool and scary, but exciting. And I think a lot of young people do that. And it's as soon as you take a picture of a guy with a machine gun, there's something that draws people to it. I think it's really dangerous. But so this again was kind of representing that beauty, that weirdness, because we have to understand, why are so many people drawn to conflicts? Why are people drawn to fight? Why are people drawn to join the army? There is something.
But
appealing.
it's a combination of here. Just looking at it, and I can only try and imagine standing there and witnessing it, and the whole, earth-shattering sound and everything that goes with it. It must be, a combination of fear and wanting not to be there.
Yeah,
and also kind of privilege and awe in, being there and being able to watch it and still be alive afterwards.
No, and the frenzy of people that were around me, whooping and shouting when all this was happening. There was like a kind of weird atmosphere going on beside me of people just seeing their firepower. It's this thing of like, my firepower is bigger than your firepower, and we just destroyed this hill, and you don't think about who the people were on that hill or what was going on in that. It's just this huge.
But seeing that and then kind of relating to the pictures, maybe it helps seeing it in this kind of screen show. Is it almost, for me, just kind of covers up the faces or the personalities and the individuals that we've seen, and it makes you think just how tiny they are compared to this. Yet we've seen them larger than life on the screen, and there's something kind of quite scary about how easily they're covered.
This is also very abstract. You don't have bits of people, the same people we've just seen, limbs all flying out. There's a deliberate choice, right, I think, to not have people in it. Although there are people in it, they're getting killed as we look at it. But you have the honesty of you saying, I'm mesmerized by this. We all find it compelling.
Well, the people are invisible.
Yeah. But there's also the kind of, I'm taking the people out of the shot, so I can justify it as Giles Duley, photographer of people, because I'm not showing them being ripped to smithereens in the picture.
Yeah, because that's the thing. I didn't want to show pictures of war where people are firing guns or people getting, but it's the opposite. We're saying like bringing into that human story. This is the opposite. Yeah. This is the abstract nature of conflict. Of course, the irony is I then got blown up the day after that picture.
Right.
That was I took those the day before I then got injured, which is kind of makes them even more.
Too close.
Too close, yeah. This is again in Kutupalong camp that there were pictures of earlier. And again, this is something I became interested in, which was taking pictures against white backgrounds. I mean, I had a background as a fashion and portrait photographer, and that's actually portraiture is where my love is. And I was really interested in taking people out of the context of the background, because again, it maybe changes the narrative, because if you see a refugee camp, then they're a refugee, and you see them that way. Whereupon if you take people out of that context and you see the portraits of them, whether that makes you see them in a different way and really see them as individuals.
I mean, I think it does, but I think it also goes back to what I was trying to say maybe about the language of photography, and not, there's no one correct way or another, but, in some ways it's a bit of a Trojan horse, using a language of a commercial kind of setting to show us a subject that isn't commercial, is a bit of a way of slipping it into our consciousness that we're more likely to, accept that from what we see on cheap magazines, doing commercial pictures.
I just did a set actually in South Sudan recently, and I was asked there to go there and take some pictures of people phoning, because basically this Akobo, they haven't spoken to family members for a couple of years, they've been cut off, and so the ICRC has taken phones so that people can make they have 2 minutes to make a phone call, and often they haven't spoken to anyone for 3 years, and they're finding out family members, their wives, whatever, in refugee camps. And I decided I wanted to do that against a white background, because people were actually putting their Sunday best on to make these phone calls, and looking really beautiful and really dressed up, and I wanted to take them out of a context. But that was brilliant, because I normally have this white sheet, and I normally try and get a bit of bamboo sticks. And the people found out what I was doing, and they made me a studio. Right. It's the most amazing. They put a wooden structure. They got like tin roofs that they nicked off somebody's house for the day.
Real occasion.
No, and they made this beautiful studio. And these pictures just look like they were shot in a London studio. They're beautifully lit. But again, it surprises people.
Shot by you and then made the phone call.
Yeah. No, so actually weren't people on the phone. They just were in the studio making their phone call. But it looks like an advertising shoot. But I like that, because it makes you challenge, because you're like, well, I thought in South Sudan poverty and all these things, and you just kind of question then what you're seeing.
Absolutely.
And like you said, there's no right or wrong, but you always have to try and maybe try and challenge that.
And as a photographer for yourself, you have to, I guess, stay excited at the possibilities, and to a certain extent have fun with it, because that,
it can't become something that becomes staged,
flowing and want to, really get into it and get the most out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be something. Again, I would say with a photograph, and it comes back to the shocking element and the question of beauty and all those things. I would say with a photograph, you have to first get people to want to look at that photograph, to draw people in. And you don't want it either to be too shocking, where people say, oh, I couldn't look at that photograph, because then again, I think I failed. Or if it's too banal, you have to think about the beauty in it, because I want people to want to look at that photograph, because that's how you draw them in.
Whether you use the Trojan horse of advertising language or not, you have to come to the photograph as a portal for more research.
Absolutely.
I'm going to flick through these ones. I mean, this was interesting, because this was getting back to the question of injury. These were the first pictures I took after I was injured,
right? And
they were all of people that had been injured in very sort of similar circumstance to myself, and I definitely think it enabled me to take pictures. I felt much more comfortable taking them.
Yeah.
I felt less
intrusive.
Embarrassed to be taking them, and more comfortable. And also, I think, although I would like to think I had empathy before, I think I changed slightly, even more so. I mean, this is a guy that lost his legs, and I know that if this was an editorial picture, they would say, well, we need to see he's got no legs. Yeah. We need to see that his legs are missing. And I actually see that when people do, my portraits now for an article, they'll be like, oh, can you just pull up your trousers a little bit? Or can you? I'm like, why? You can see they're uncomfortable, because their editors told them, oh, we need to see he's got no legs.
It has to all be in one picture.
Yeah. And for me, actually, what was this guy's story was that he had a family of 8 people that he was supporting, and he never spoke to me about his sadness of losing his legs. He kept saying, I don't know how I'll look after my family. And it was like, for me, he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, that like, how do I look after my family now? How do I look after my mother? How do I look after my kids? How do I look after my brother? And for me, that was the story. So I think maybe my own experience has made me less focused on the very obvious.
I mean, now when you say that, also, you do see that kind of the ridge of the shoulder.
Yeah, and that for me,
bearing down on them.
And I didn't need to show that he'd lost his legs to show that, things weren't great.
We're Whereas if you had, we would have just read that and probably moved on quicker than what we just have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy that's just been told his leg was going to be amputated. They'd just been given him the news that it was so infected that they needed to amputate the leg. And again, for me, the story was more in his face than...
I mean, these are incredibly personal moments for people as well. You know, especially like that. You know, when he's kind of contemplating what he's just been told. So, have you managed to, in some ways, you know, not getting back to the consent necessarily, but built some kind of trust to feel that you can take that moment with him almost?
Well, because I think I mean, I've been sitting with him the day before. This is the emergency hospital in Kabul, and I'd spent time there. It's an amazing hospital, and I've been able to kind of talk to people. And actually, he had asked me what I thought about the possibility this might happen, and I was kind of going, well, I don't know what you're moaning about. It's one leg, you know. It's like, but those are opportunities that wouldn't come about any other way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But still, when it's his moment,
but it's still,
it's his own thing.
And weirdly, it sometimes almost feels more intrusive on that kind of personal moment of reflection than a moment of action.
Yeah.
But also because you spent the day talking about it, and jokes aside about your legs and so on, you've also slightly disappeared to get this image that we're all looking at.
Yeah.
And to get what we're seeing or think we're seeing, although we've been told something about it too, you have to slightly disappear in the room too. And part of that is because of what you've built up through him, through what happened to you, but also through your investing time with him. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't get the sense of your intervention
No.
in that. No.
But then that's become even harder because we're talking about this idea of not being a fly on the wall and that any photographer is like an elephant in a room.
But that's just common. You know,
Now it's
that's like the
yeah.
same with anyone who you're most familiar with, and you know.
But you still, yeah,
you still have a moment where it's their moment, not
Yeah.
yours.
and you just, yeah, you do have to step back slightly and I mean, actually, this was a guy who insisted that I went and photographed him having his leg debrided.
Right.
And he was like, I really want a picture of this. I want you to... And I actually wasn't that comfortable about doing it myself. But it was something he
But
wanted.
that's almost in place of him being there to witness it himself.
Yeah, no, he
because
really...
he was experiencing
yeah.
it, but not seeing it from the outside.
Or this one of... this is Sedacola. And Sedacola, he'd been playing with a UXO, an unexploded bomb. It had gone off in his hands and he'd lost a few fingers. And he was such a defiant kid, and you know, and he again wanted me to go and photograph him, and so he did this picture, and he was just staring at me as I was taking this photograph. It was quite unnerving almost. He was so strong. But actually, the funny thing about Sedacola is I later did some nice portraits of him, and on the last day, I kind of took this picture, and I managed to get it printed in Kabul, which was quite hard. This nice portrait of him, and he was leaving, and I said, "Say, look, I've got this picture for you." And he kind of looked at it, and he was so disappointed. He was kind of like going...
That's not the one
and I was
that's
like,
not what he had in mind of himself.
And what he wanted is he wanted the picture during the operation of his hands all bloody, being cut up so he could tote back and show his mates back at school. He was like, oh no, I want the other...
They can't do that.
No, because I was trying to do like this really sensitive picture, you know, I didn't want him to see his bloody hands. And he's like, no, but I want to show my friends like my finger blown off.
Can't win.
No. But again, I think that's where we can put our own narrative and think, oh, we've got to protect him. And no, he's just a 12-year-old kid that like thinks it's really cool that his finger's been blown off.
Exactly.
This is a picture that I always refer to when people ask me like why I still do the work that I do. This is Atola, who was injured just a few miles away from where I was injured just a couple of months after, and he was walking to school one day and stepped on a landmine and lost his arm and his leg. And I've never photographed anybody that really, we talk about not being seen, he just didn't see me. Like I was taking these pictures. And normally as well people react, kids react because they see I'm missing legs, they ask. He didn't care, he was just like in his own world. Obviously incredibly traumatized by what had happened to him.
But was there a sense for you, like, you know, just on a personal level of like returning to the scene of a crime?
Yeah, I mean...
You know, was that an important...
I think
process as well.
I mean, I think again for me, going back to Afghanistan was like if I could achieve that, then anything was achievable.
You could go on from there.
Yeah, I could go on, and I mean, it was really hard to go back to a place that obviously where you got injured and all these things happened. But at the same time,
you had the focus of
But yeah,
focusing on other people to...
exactly. And
You're also completing a story, right?
I was completing a story,
The story you were trying to
something,
photograph in the first
yeah,
place.
something I'd set out to do when I went there. And also, it's really when I didn't become the story anymore, which for me was a great relief. And that, you know, no matter what I go through, I know every day for people it's a hell of a lot worse. You know, for Atola, his life is, you know, I can't compare my life to him. So, you know, I kind of feel more than ever I have a duty to tell those stories. This is always a picture I really struggle with in a lot of ways, and this is again getting back to the rights and wrongs, and there are no rights and wrongs, but for myself of taking a photograph. This was a story again with MSF actually on the difficulties with labour in mortality rates in childbirth in South Sudan, which has, you know, incredibly high child mortality rates, and one of the big problems is people only go to the hospitals when something's already gone wrong. So then often something does happen, and then they say, well, don't go to hospital because if you go there, your baby will die. So this woman had come, and she was already in a great deal of discomfort and problems, and as she was giving birth, the child died, and then there were other issues, and I actually ended up kind of acting as the nurse on this case. And what happened was beyond horrific, really. And again, I had to make that choice of a photograph, and how do I take a photograph of something that was so shocking, and still kind of keep the dignity of the person who you're photographing.
So there was a child being cut out of her, wasn't there? There's
Basically, the child had to be cut up, and it was, beyond horrific.
The reason why I always return to talking about this photograph, which is why you stopped, for me is that you could have got the kind of shot of the things going on, the Pulitzer Prize winning moment where you have the entire narrative. But I feel like this is, just going back to what John and you were saying a few minutes ago about the guy on the bed, the cover shot of the book. There's this incredible, especially once you know what's happening, sense of you're not shooting the explicit thing. For me, it's an incredibly lasting, worthwhile image, precisely because you didn't stick your camera down the kind of.
But there's still
the middle of the narrative, which is this
I think
profoundly upsetting thing.
without telling the back story to it, it's, for me, we've stopped on it, so we're going to try and, describe what it means or what it kind of evokes. But there are so many little small elements in there, whether it's the key around her neck, the color of the chain, the glove, all these things that you could take issue with of is it about that? Is it about that? Is it about this kind of medical staff relationship to a patient? Is it about, but the thing that really is right at the center of it is just that kind of it's a bit like the guy looking into the distance, having just heard that he's going to have his leg taken. It's, just kind of breathing into the, through her teeth, through her mouth, of just, you don't know what's going on down there where the rest of her is, but you know that it's just something that's, taking the breath out of her, taking the life away from her, in such a strong way. So, but I do think you need the kind of almost the details of the backstory, to kind of fill in, what you think you're looking at and your interpretation of it through, your own mind and imagination to confirm it, so that you're not just going off on a, going off on a
and that's where words and photographs, because I think sometimes in words you can describe the horrors of things without it being so graphic.
It's just boiled down, isn't it? It becomes quite iconic, and I guess that's why also one could have a problem with it, because it just becomes too simplified, or too many of the elements that you could discount for the wrong reasons.
You're also trusting the photographer to tell us the rest of the narrative. There's
Absolutely.
an amazing story in the Balkan War of these images of children that have been shot, and both the Croats and the Serbs distributed exactly the same pictures of saying, these are our children, look what they've done to our kids, they've done this to our kids, and they were the same photographs, but people were giving different picture captions. So you have to also trust the person who was
Absolutely, and in
taking
this
pictures
case,
for the
you know, the
natural.
picture and what you think in a iconic kind of way, it lives up to the actual, to the story. So it's not a simplification in that sense, I guess. Very strong.
This is actually a picture I'm going to flick to, just because I love this picture. This is Wedi and Unis, who were at the Salam Center in Sudan, which is emergencies cardiac hospital. And again, it's actually really lovely to be able to photograph something that, when people say, why do we help with NGOs? Why do we donate money? Why do we, what can we do to make the world better? People always kind of use that thing of Africa, like it's one problem. But it's always nice to actually be able to show at times a photograph that is, these two young kids that had heart surgery. A couple of days before I'd seen them, they couldn't walk, they didn't have the energy to do anything. They had the heart surgery, and a couple of days later they were singing, dancing.
Cheeky grin.
Yeah, cheeky grin. I mean, I actually went to visit them 3 years later in Kenya, and they're kind of growing up now, and they have these great lives. So it is nice sometimes, as I say, in this work to be able to as well show why we do it.
And how important is, how often do you get the opportunity to follow up, like you say, 3 years later, or
Well, increasingly I do,
Right.
and increasingly it's really important for me. So I'm going back to Lebanon to follow up a story of a family I've been documenting for 3 years. And
you're still photographing
yeah,
the visit. It's not like you stop.
no. And so for me, actually building those relationships, because time is one of the kind of secrets of photography. And photography is so rushed now. Most photographers they're sending on assignments for 2 weeks, for a week to get a story. I often go back a year, 2 years, and I still haven't worked out what the story is. So yeah, building relationships and actually following up is.
So, but also then kind of going back to your title is that
Yes.
your 1 second it's not really a second, because it's it's a drawn out relationship that you are
Yeah.
living with through that through those years.
Well, because photography is basically an equation of light and time. That's what makes a photograph, and often that time element is taken out. So we focus a lot on light, but actually time is hugely important, and time can be not just about the speed of the photograph, but the
extended
extended.
relation.
Yeah.
This is what we just talked about is a great example of these guys getting better and living and becoming teenagers and living in adolescence, and you were saying immediately singing afterwards. If you go back somewhere and you've kind of covered a story, I hate that phrase, but you've gone and photographed somebody and something's happened to them, is it important that the story has changed? Like, people talk about timeless photographs. I mean, these could be timeless photographs for the exact wrong reason. Like, does it matter to you that your photographs have contributed to something that's changed in their lives? Or, I imagine it does, but isn't it, if you go and see somebody 3 years later, I imagine most of these scenarios there hasn't been a change. Of course, there is in Angola, there is in this example of these people's lives, but how do you deal with that? And
No, I mean, in many ways, this book is a book of abject failure, you could say, because most of the stories are still going on. And actually, this would be a really good example. This was in Jordan 3 years ago. And it was the first time I started covering the Syrian refugee crisis. And it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. We were waiting in Zathri camp, and people had told me, that they'll start coming at night. And then you can hear mortar shells that are firing in the distance, which basically means they're trying to cross the border. So the government forces were firing at them. And then suddenly you started seeing these shapes coming out of the darkness, and this little girl, probably 4 or 5, she had this little coat on, and she was the first, and she just was marching forward. And then you could see people, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And
literally kind of hunched,
Yeah.
creeping under the cover of
yeah, and she was really like,
trying to get through.
she was wearing her sort of Sunday best clothes again, and really dressed up and really striding through. But, for me, I was talking to a journalist the other day, and we were sort of saying, well, maybe we failed that because we've been covering this crisis for 3 years, 4 years, and the world hasn't acted about it. So, if we were really doing our job, and we can argue about whether it's the media's fault and blah, 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 but if we are doing our job is to educate people and to get people to understand these stories, and something is going wrong where I'm photographing the same scenes exactly. This photograph I could have taken last week, but I took this one 3 years ago, but I'm taking exactly the same picture. So you do kind of think, well, what am I doing? What am I doing if I'm taking the same picture?
What do you do with that frustration?
I mean,
you can boil it down to the individual stories and know one person is going to be indicative of the next.
But it really is a struggle at the moment, because I do feel like I'm taking the same photographs and it's not having any impact. So you question, am I doing something wrong? You know,
or should the cameras focus back on us for not doing anything? But that's different looking story.
And I say these are all pictures taken 3 years ago that could have been taken yesterday.
Does a book help with that? Is a book relevant? Is a book passé? Or having these pictures, revisiting these pictures and disseminating them and having them?
I suppose, for me, most of the pictures in the book were never published because I was told they were irrelevant or lack of interest. And again, like these pictures, nobody was interested in 3 years ago, and then suddenly everyone's like, we want pictures of, refugees now. And so I suppose in that sense, my loyalty is always with the people I photograph, because I do spend time with everybody and I feel like it's their story. And I suppose by putting it in a book as well, it kind of makes it feel like I've done as much as I can now. I've got their stories published. I would say the pictures that upset me the most are the ones that nobody ever sees, because they've cut it out of the edit. And I always think, well, I didn't take a good enough picture. I didn't do them justice.
I was going to say, the book is almost like, they're not hidden away in a drawer.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to be asked to see them. They're out there,
Yeah, because there's nothing worse than having somebody's story.
Yeah.
Somebody's told you their story, a really powerful, moving story, and then you kind of file it away somewhere. Then I feel like, why did they tell me that story? Why? Because they wanted something to happen.
Makes you a lousy conduit and advocate.
Yeah.
No matter how good the picture was, if it didn't get out.
You failed completely. So actually, this is the last story, and this was the Ukrainian street kids. And this is probably a pivotal point in going from the pictures we showed at the beginning of Angola and being very reverential to going and trying to break down the narrative, because the pictures I'd seen of the street kids in Ukraine were all living in cellars with this great light. And I'd actually gone there half thinking, oh, it's great light, these people living in cellars injecting drugs. And when I got there, I'm like, but that's not the story. And that was going on, but I was interested in the day-to-day life of these kids, because they
like adolescents.
Well, exactly, and there was violence in the house, and there were these things, but there was just day-to-day goofing around and being bored and being silly and being kids. Again, doing each other's hair. It was a very normal. And there's a picture. This picture, for me, people say, "What's the most shocking photograph?" And sometimes I say this one, because these 12, 13-year-old kids that have lost everything, that I was told were drug addicts, that were criminals. Actually, what I saw is in the morning, they would sweep up and they would try and make their life normal. And it broke my heart, because he thought, actually, they just wanted to be a normal household. They had no idea how to be one. They'd grown up in dysfunctional homes themselves. They'd often, been perpetrated on them violence and sexual violence. But actually, all they wanted was this kind of idealistic little family life. And that, for me, was much more moving than pictures of them injecting drugs or shoplifting.
It's like so close, but so far.
Yeah. I mean, this is when one of them had self-harmed and all the others were disinfecting her wound and cleaning it. And there was these moments of tenderness that were much more relevant, I think. And then this is the last picture in the book, and I mean, it's a story I've told before, but this was on the last day I'd gone down to the Black Sea with these kids. It was kind of farewell celebration, which involved kind of vodka and gherkins. And I say a farewell celebration, they did this every day, but they told me it was a farewell celebration. And Sasha, the leader of the gang, had said, let's go swimming in the Black Sea, which is obviously what they're doing here. And I was kind of a bit reticent, because I'm like, well, it's pretty polluted, and I was also going to have to leave all my possessions with these street kids, and you were told, like, watch out for the street kids, watch out for crime, don't go swimming in the Black Sea. So I kind of did all those things, and I'm in the Black Sea, and the kids had my cameras and my passport, my wallet, and I'm just thinking, this, I always talk about trust. Trust is earned, and like, it's really important. This is where I look like the idiot, and they run off with my stuff. And fair enough, because they needed it more than I did. And I go down to the police station in my wet pants, and they say, well, what happened? And I go, well, I gave my stuff to some street kids because I wanted to go swimming in the Black Sea. What could go wrong? But actually, when I was in there, and this is Lilik, here having a cigarette, and he had my camera. And what he was doing was going around on the beach, and he was stamping. And when seagulls took off, he was taking a photograph of the seagulls.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, wow, he's got like this real vision. It wasn't just a snapshot of his mates. He was thinking.
Experimenting.
Yeah, and so I said to him, I'll get you a camera. And this was the last night I was with them. And when I went back on the way to the airport the next day, he'd died in the night. He had taken too many pills that they nicked from the pharmacy, or vodka, or a mixture of all those things. And the police had come and taken him and dumped him in a sort of unmarked grave. And for me, that's exactly why I do all this work. And to have his picture, again, the story was never published. Nobody was interested in it. And so for actually to see him, in a book, it's going to bring me to tears again. But it just felt like that's the only way I could sort of respect his story.
Wow.
And the stories of all these people in this book is that they deserve to have their story heard. I don't know if we want to open it to questions. Or
Yeah, I think that would be a good place
Yeah.
to...
Time to
Yeah.
end the three of us.
I've got a question. Are you shooting? I'm sorry. Are you shooting digitally?
Most of this was shot digitally. I've actually gone back to shooting on film now.
So my second question was going to be, how do you decide whether you're going to present them in black and white or in colour?
Because I'm still learning colour, I can't really suss it out. I get very confused by colour. And I often intend to shoot in colour, and then just for me, black and white, it's instinct. It's no... But I mean, now I shoot almost wholly on film, because it's kind of almost simplified that, and I shoot on black and white, apart from the odd times if it's colour. But it's purely an instinctual thing. And as I say, it is interesting when you have pictures, and again, this is something that happens a lot in editorial, is Sunday supplements will go, why do you think it's called a colour supplement? Because you're going with a black and white story. So now I shoot it on film and go, well, you can't do anything about it now. It's like, it is black and white. But the amount of times, you go with these pictures and go, can we see the colour file? Can we?
Yeah, I think that's always a problem. I think you have to be quite insistent and say,
Yeah.
I'm probably the other side of it, saying, can I see the colour file?
Yeah.
But
Actually,
yeah,
I felt like a complete dinosaur in Lesbos, because I very rarely work where there are press photographers, and they're all trying to find cafes to upload pictures and all the rest of it. I'm trying to find a post office because I need to send my film back. It's like, I felt like a complete dinosaur there, but it's kind of nice because it means that is what it is. And
or like giving it to someone at the airport and
Yeah.
wondering whether it will get there.
yeah, which also kind of was very normal years
Yeah.
ago, but now when you say to somebody, can you just carry this bag on the airport?
No, it's not usually well received.
Hi. I had a question first for Giles and then for the three of you. Sometimes, there's a lot of humanity in some of these tough places, but people can also be very tough. And I noticed you're filming, since you had your injuries in 2011, you're taking shots of either amputees or complete junkies or something, out of it. I was just wondering if you ever get aggression from others, because people... I don't know, maybe they don't want to be photographed by someone who has no arms and legs. And then the other question to all of you is, do you think that I saw your last picture was a square. I was just wondering, all our sense of perspective is based on portrait, rectangular. And I was just wondering how you thought moving on Instagram, if that's going to affect the way we take photographs moving forward.
First question, I don't know anybody that's been pissed off that I've got no legs when I'm taking their picture. It's funny. I don't think I've ever really had anybody not want. Like, it's always been understood before I went to take a picture that they didn't want to have a picture taken, and it's, as I say, it's very sensitive at the moment with like Syrians and when people are kind of coming off boats and it's crisis. You don't want to be just snapping away when often they're fearful of their families back home and those things. But as I say, it's one of those really unspoken things. It's an eye contact thing often in a critical situation where you just look at somebody, and I would like to think I know whether they're comfortable for me to take that photograph, and a lot of times I won't, and a lot of times I don't take photographs, and people say, oh, you missed the shot, but I would rather miss the shot. But I've never had a situation, I can't think of one, where I've been really confronted by somebody who got angry about a photograph I'd taken, which actually is not true. Liam Gallagher, when I used to do music photography, we got in a fight in a Glasgow hotel once about a picture I took of him But that's about the only circumstance I can think of, really.
And the square?
And the square, well, it's funny because although, the Instagram square, at the same time, so much photography early on was done through square format. So, the larger format cameras were almost square.
Yeah.
And it was only really with the 35mm camera that it became, and, a lot of iconographic photography of music especially was done, with a Hasselblad, which was a square format. And it's funny, I mean,
But also Diane Arbus and a sort of generation of...
And actually there is something quite comfortable about a square and shooting a square. I've just recently started doing Instagram. I've really enjoyed the fact that it's a square and that format. And I'll be interested to know why they chose that. But it is something that seems to, people like.
I mean, I think it's a different way of seeing things, isn't it? It's a different way of putting them in, of squeezing everything into a frame and just making it work. I mean, I'd like to see a round format. I'd like to break out of the box and but people do try that. It's just, I guess, it's how you transmit it. It's not only the taking it and the framing it; it's also the disseminating it. Round's not such an easy thing to disseminate, and I guess maybe square comes into that.
But another point I'd say about Instagram, again, it's a great example of how, in a time of like moving images, video, and the rest of it, young people still love taking photographs and love taking still photographs. So there's something still that, despite every other technology, people find incredibly powerful about a still image, and that's for me is really exciting. Despite all the technology, despite all those things, people get such a kick out of that.
I think there was definitely a period where people in photography were like fearful. I remember, what was it, Kessel Kramer did this, filled a room with, 1 day's worth of Flickr photos or something. And the idea was that, pictures have just become so cheap. It's just, it's a whole room the size of this filled to the ceiling with pictures. And it just was, to indicate how cheap it was. But actually, it's this new generation that's saying, I can read them at the speed of, speed of a thumb click, and that's not too many pictures.
No, exactly. There's process them in it.
There's
Well.
also
It's just what we
I don't
do
think it
with
was
them and how we
implied
find them.
in your question, but there's also this, and it comes across from a lot of other photographers, especially in the art world, but all over, that somehow, because there's this proliferation of pictures, that the people taking them are less sophisticated photographers. And I would argue the contrary. Like, John has kids roughly the same age as mine. People are taking a lot of photographs. They're still trying to do things with them. In fact, the baggage that we have of the notion, the kind of Richard Avedon West notion of the one portrait tells the entire, story of this person's life is absolute bullshit. And there's this kind of old, antiquated notion. The people using Instagram and the 2 or 3 generations now that are getting used to taking lots of photographs are much more sophisticated about what a photograph can and can't be. And so the fear, I think, I mean, not every photograph, obviously, but the fear, and it's not a William Eggleston thing either, the fear you're talking about is I think, of a certain trained photographer who has this vainglorious notion that they, in their great intelligence, will choose the right moment, the narrative that can, looking around this room, looking at coat hangers, something that they, in their sophisticated way, and nobody else can do. And I would suggest that people, and the overabundance of photographs is kind of learning how to take photography.
There's a lot of that, definitely on one side, which is quite encouraging. Yeah. But there's also, no monopoly on being able to take a bad picture either. No. And, there's certainly a lot more rubbish pictures out there as well. And, photographers who've grand ideas, they also have rubbish pictures on their Instagram accounts. So it opens it up to everyone.
So, firstly, I have to say that those were some great photos, and having worked in some of those camps, it's wonderful to see that viewpoint. I have 2 questions. One is, coming from a sort of a documentary background, how much direction do you give to the subjects of your portrait photography? I mean, how do you know when you've sort of got the portrait? And then the second thing is, I'm sure you've seen local or insider photographs of the same subjects. I would be interested to know what you think they saw that you didn't see, and also vice versa.
In terms of the portraiture, it's funny, it's only recently I've got people to slightly look away from the camera. I always just stuck so basically, just like look at my camera, and kept it really simple. And there's such a basic element to that of just look at me. And And again, people say, well, that's not documentary photography, and I always say, well, I'm documenting somebody having their photograph taken. It's kind of like it's a really basic thing. I have this white sheet. Somebody holds a white sheet behind the person stands there and looks at the camera, and it's just the most simple form of photography. And I like that because it lets people breathe and be themselves in so many ways, and there's nowhere to hide. It is just you and that person. And again, weirdly, often people, it kind of feels like they feel like you're doing something. You're capturing them. You're documenting them. I've had people come up to me and say they've seen what I'm doing, saying, "Can I come and have my picture taken?" And I said yes, and they said, "Oh, can we come tomorrow though? Because I want to." And they can maybe come with their wife and they're wearing their best clothes, and you take a photograph, and I'm like, "Can I try and send this to you?" And they're like, "No, we don't want the picture." They just wanted to be documented. And so in terms of the portrait, I don't direct at all. I literally just say, look at me, and it's just and I normally just shoot a few frames. I don't take many pictures. In terms of what others see.
You're dislocating, but you never tell somebody to bring a prop or to wear something or.
No, absolutely, and it's just purely
tools for the narrative.
Yeah, just stand there and I'll take the photograph and keep it really, really simple. And sometimes, it will just be 3 frames or 4 frames, and if it's there, it's there. In terms of what other people see, I love the fact that you can put 9, 10 photographers in a room and they all take completely different photographs. I think that's one of the most exciting things about photography, and why I love looking at photographs of places that I've been. And there's this argument about whether like a Western photographer should go and document something in anywhere really. I mean, Bangladesh, why we should go there. Because I think equally, I'd love to see a Bangladeshi photographer documenting London. They would see things in a different way. We see things through our own eyes, and it's about seeing all the different types of images. I think that's the key for me. So I love seeing other people's perspectives of the same things that I've seen. And I don't know why they see it differently. And I'm often looking going, how did they see that? But then, maybe sometimes people look at my pictures and go, well, I didn't see that there. So.
I was noticing that obviously a lot of your photographs are very harrowing. Do you worry that it has a psychological toll on you as the photographer? Sorry if that's a personal question.
No. I mean, if it didn't bother me, and I think because I increasingly take less photographs. The more I work, I take less and less photographs. So I will spend days with people and take maybe 2 or 3 frames. But those pictures really are etched in my brain. And, most of the people here in these photographs, I can tell you their names and I can remember everything about them. And they live with me. And, definitely a lot of these photographs really haunt me. And they haunt me knowing these people are often in the same circumstance. I think if there's a point when it stops bothering me, is a point when I have to stop doing the work. I think it should bother me. I think it should. So it's an attribute in that. Yeah, it should disquiet me. It should make me feel really uncomfortable, and make me want to know what's happened to these people and try and follow up those stories. And the time when it doesn't is probably when it means I've done it too long.
Probably take these last 2, and then I think we're done.
Hi there. First of all, I want to say I love your work. I think it's incredible, and I'm really moved by it. And I greatly respect how you've been talking about the relationship you have with the people whom you've photographed. The woman who was in the hospital, you had this incredible photograph with just her shoulders and face, as she was having surgery. Did you have a relationship with her, or did you have permission from her? I mean, how does that work?
There was definitely permission. I wouldn't say a relationship, but as I say, there is nobody. There's about 2 or 3 photographs in this whole collection which are taken in the hospital in Afghanistan, which were emergency situations. They were the only pictures I would say were taken before I'd had a conversation with the people. Every other photograph, I've always spoken to the person before I've taken the photograph. Again, this is not about right and wrong, because sometimes it's important that people get the photograph before anybody's aware of it. I personally have always preferred, and increasingly prefer, to have conversations with people before I take a photograph. So everybody has given me permission to take the photograph.
Is it simplistic to say, sorry, I'm butting in your question, that the conversations you have with people lead to the photograph, so the photograph can't happen increasingly for you without the conversation? It's not a nicety or a moral thing. It's also that the conversation you have the day before with the guy on the cover, or lots of examples of your photograph, that the conversation becomes something other that leads to the photograph. In other words, the photograph wouldn't exist in its form without the conversation.
The knowledge now, and it's increasingly so, and that's why those pictures at the beginning of the book from Angola weren't like that, because I wasn't really engaging with those people. Now, the engagement I have with the person informs the photograph I take. So the person whose leg was going to be amputated, it's because I knew his story. I knew that moment was kind of coming, and I'd shared that journey with him up to that point, that I could capture that photograph. If I just turned up, didn't know anything about him, I probably wouldn't even be aware that that was a poignant moment, why he was looking like that. But I knew what had happened that day because I'd been talking to him, getting to know his story, and actually knew that he was going to be finding out the news that day. So increasingly, that is so vital to me, is knowing the story, and it helps me to find the image, as opposed to just taking lots of photographs. I often kind of am searching for something that I know is telling the story that I already know.
The last question.
You've spoken about your frustration in photos that you've taken 3 years ago that could have actually just been taken a week ago because of the lack of impact. Have there been any situations that you found so horrifying that you felt that you needed to kind of turn your back on your feelings for not taking the really obvious and gratuitous photo, and actually needing to take the most obvious photo so that it had more of an impact kind of around the world?
I mean, what's happening in Lesbos right now would be a perfect example, you know, where you see babies dying because they've got hypothermia and they haven't got the right oxygen mask for that child. I've still chosen not to take that because there are people taking those photographs, so I don't feel I will add to it. If somebody is already doing that photograph, why would I kind of push my way in to try and take it? But there's a point in me as well which then looks at my photographs and thinks it's not like I'm so angry that I want a photograph that is shouting. And my photographs don't shout. My photographs are maybe that people reflect and think about over time. And sometimes I think I need to take that picture that actually makes people go, ah. But I'm probably not equipped to do that, and I'll let other people do it. But yeah, there are times when I think I wish I was taking something that was more violent in the photograph, more angry, whereupon my photographs are calmer and more reflective. But yeah, sometimes I wish I was able to do that.
Thank you.